And finally, I can introduce the person who will give the keynote today, a professor of early modern literature and critical theory. And I think it's quite an achievement that having a German background, she can become a professor of English literature in Oxford. Her research focus is women's utopian writings in the 17th and 18th centuries. The very few people who knows more about European salons of the time and the Blue Stockings movement. And also I looked at the list of her research grants and awards, and I recognized I could not learn how many things she's already won, nor achieve anything close to that. Currently, she's an academic editor of the Electronic Enlightenment project of the Oxford Bodleian Library. I think this is a very, very interesting area. And basically why everyone knows her in her circles is that because she has been the editor-in-chief of the Utopian Studies Journal for 13 years. And I also cooperated with her, and it was a fantastic cooperation. And basically what I can say about her is that I never met anybody who did not like her. And that's mainly because of her friendly attitudes and her willingness to share her great knowledge. So Professor Nicole Pohl, I would like to ask you to share your knowledge with us now.
I can give you a list of people who don't like me. It's quite long, I think. Bless you. Thank you so much to the organizers of bringing us together here today and to a really important topic. And as a little follow-up from Greg as well, I remember Lyman Tower Sargent saying to me quite early onwards, if you have utopias as a academic specialism, you ruin your career. So there we are. So I'll pass this on to the younger scholars here. Maybe have another specialism, I don't know. But what I wanted to do today is actually reflect on certain things. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here because, as Zsolt said, I'm a literary scholar. My specialism is the 18th century Enlightenment. So, but I'm going to throw lots of stuff at you and you might be depressed at the end. There we are. There's nothing I can do about it. As we are in Hungary, I'm going to take some of the quotations from Viktor Orban. It's quite nice that populists provide you with key terms that I want to investigate today. So I'm going to do that. So in 2021, Orban said, freedom and patriotism are the great two pillars of strength of Hungary of 1,000 years. And these two pillars are connected by a beam of loyalty. So I'm going to actually focus on freedom, patriotism, and loyalty as well. So thank you for that. Then the next one is the Hungarian nation is not simply a group of individuals, but a community that must be organized, reinforced, and in fact constructed, which is also really important. And so in this sense, the new state that we are constructing in Hungary is an illiberal state, not a non-liberal state. It does not reject the fundamental principles of liberalism, such as freedom, and I could list a few more, but it does not make this ideology the central element of state organization, but instead includes a different special national approach. So again, this is a very useful quotation and we will unpack this together. And then I'm sure you all love this at the end. Progressive liberals are dangerous because they seek to realize their utopian dreams. So maybe we should have this as a motto. Possibly. I'll leave this up for a little bit for you to muse over it. So I chose these quotations, obviously, because we're in Hungary, we're in Budapest, but also because they aptly summarize the gorge of ideological warfare between groups of different political spectrums that we note across the Western Hemisphere. And Greg just alluded to that a little bit. Orban uses the terms patriotism, freedom, and loyalty and utopia in a populist and neo-nationalist framework. So for him, I think patriotism is loyalty to Hungary, but also loyalty to a larger Christian European state, but not the EU. So he makes that distinction. He hates the EU, I think, I'm not sure. And this larger Christian European state is supposed to be bulwark against immigration and Islamic extremism. What I find quite interesting is because Putin does the same, is he cites a period in Hungarian history as a kind of evidence, but also justification. So he goes back to the medieval Hungarian-Ottoman wars, but also the Treaty of the Trianon, which settled the first world borders of Hungary. One of the successor states of the defeated Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And he cites and takes this historical experience, Hungary, as evidence that Hungary experienced firsthand foreign and particularly Islamic oppression. So this is a kind of revisionist history, really. Then he also uses freedom, another word used also by Trump and coming from Britain, by right-wing parties there, it's about sovereignty, national sovereignty. And I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, the Hungarians, is this freedom, this sovereignty was recently cemented into the National Sovereignty Protection Act of 2023. Am I right in that? Which kind of limits the impact of foreign companies in Hungary. So this historical revisionism, also noted in Trump and Putin's speeches, creates a new, or perhaps more accurately, a nostalgic imagined community as a nation. And this is, of course, reference to Benedict Anderson. So the past in this context is a political battlefield, but also an object of affection expressed in patriotism. Underpinning this is a rejection of self-critical readings of national history, allegedly imposed by progressive, anti-patriotic, and self-serving elites, such as us, I think. Populist questions the state and the academy as sources of historical authority, claiming instead the people's right to the patriotic pride necessary for national vigor. As an aside, Sebastian Faber calls this a form of memory activism. And in fact, he argues it's not only employed by the populists, by the right, but also a left-wing political fraction. So that's quite a useful term, I think. Now, what is at stake in all these debates is, if one can call them debates, are different takes on key political terms that are burdened by ideologies, historical revisionism, xenophobia, power struggles, and ultimately fear, perhaps a backlash against globalism. What is at stake also are very different visions of our political futures in the face of globalization, climate destruction, and its consequences, which is, for instance, climate refugees. This clash of ideologies became particularly apparent most recently during the EU parliamentary elections. And it set up, or it continued to set up, I guess, political antagonisms between democracy and freedom, between patriotism and liberalism, and between nationalism and liberal pluralism. Lots of isms here. Bad sentence, never mind, you get what I'm saying. The concept of utopia, particularly in populist parlance, seems to have reverted back to ideology or anti-utopianism. The question I pose to you today is if amidst the gorge of ideological wars, utopian thought is at all useful. I don't have the answer to that, by the way, in case you ask me, I don't know. But is utopia, as some critics have suggested, akin to populism in its totalizing and universalizing core? And that's something to think about. Indeed, as Pierre Rema suggests, following the electoral success of populist movements in Europe and the Americas throughout the 2010s and after, liberal democracy is widely believed to be in crisis. And it was quite interesting that for the European election, certainly from the German parties, one of the slogans from the West was "Protect Democracy." It has been common for democratic theorists to compare this crisis of liberal democracy to the crisis of parliamentary democracy of the 1920s and 30s, and you can see why the comparison is obvious. This interprets, however, contemporary populism as an echo of the utopian movements of the early 20th century. And for many, this comparison is made explicitly. So Mark Haugard, for example, likens the populist phenomenon whereby, and I quote, people who feel marginalized but were previously compliant due to dominant ideology have decided to become political. And also Hannah Arendt, of course, said that the totalitarian movements of the 1930s were the result of previously unpolitical groups becoming political. So what I'm highlighting here is the possible overlapping discursive themes between the modernist utopianism of the early 20th century and contemporary populist movements. The question that arises from this kind of comparison, I'm not sure if I agree with this comparison, is that it focuses on one specific strand of utopianism of the early 20th century. And I point you to Greg's work, of course, who questioned that there was a distinct dystopian turn at the dawn of modernity. And I would suggest that indeed it was both utopia and dystopia that responded in different ways to the historical and political challenges of modernity. So my point is that to make that comparison between contemporary populism and early 20th century utopianism is perhaps complicated or more complex than some critics make it out. Now, others might say that after 1945, 1968, and again after 1989, utopia died with the end of history. That's a kind of known argument. As David Bell suggests, utopianism is held to be over there or back then. There's simply no need for it anymore. Others were utopians, the communists, the Nazis, the crackpots, the eccentrics, but not us. We just happen to inhabit a world in which the best possible system of governance has been developed. I don't mind actually being a crackpot or an eccentric, so I hope you join me in this conference. Or, and I cited Viktor Orban earlier, progressive liberals are dangerous because they seek to realize their utopian dreams. I suggested elsewhere that that cosmopolitan webs of corporations are the only weapon against, as George Washington warned in his farewell address in 1796, I told you I'm an 18th century person, the baneful effects of the spirit of the party. Today, I want to expand on this and firstly ask if democracy without borders, true citizenships of the world, might be a viable answer to neo-nationalism and populism. A utopian answer in the sense of utopia being a critical and reflective method. Of course, this is Ruth Levitas. To echo her, cosmopolitanism as a utopia can be an invitation to a better future, a reflexive method to imagine different futures in time and space. So for this purpose, I will remind you of two World Citizens projects, Democracy Without Borders, that's a logo there, and then Gary Davis, who fashioned himself as the citizen of the world #1. He threw away his US passport and then issued himself with a passport to freedom. So these are two examples of cosmopolitanism in practice, cosmopolitics within and beyond the nation, where the perspective of global social justice and equality is included. But there were also more concrete attempts to deal with global challenges without the abstract universalism of cosmopolitanism. And in my reflections, I draw on Ruth Levitas, but also on Rebecca Letteval and also Diane Morgan, who sits in the hall, who knows much more about Immanuel Kant and cosmopolitanism than I will ever know. So I draw on all of these people. But in the face of climate destruction, I would close with an appeal to planetarity. Indeed, in the face of climate destruction, states will collapse, national borders and identities will not matter. So I will conclude with reference to Main and Wainwright in their book, Climate Leviathan, A Political Theory of Our Planetary Future, which came out in 2018. a political framework that returns to political agency, democracy in its truest sense, social and climate justice to the world and the planet. I think I've got a picture there. Oh no, I don't, sorry. So I will then close with the different understanding of patriotism based on the 18th century reading of patriotism is about the common good. And I will argue at the end for planetary common good for non-human and human species alike. So this is not going to be fun, but there we are. So I start with patriotism. Patriotism has of late become a much, if crudely used word in Western politics. It has morphed into an umbrella term for nostalgic nationalism, populism, nativism, and xenophobia, aligning values such as loyalty to the nation, and more importantly, to the people, to popular sovereignty and anti-elitism. As such, it also positions itself against cosmopolitanism and the professed elitist citizens of the world. Indeed, when the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Theresa May, declared at the Conservative Party conference in 2016, we had lots of different prime ministers after that. If you believe you are the citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And she accentuated with that the populist agenda. Kwame Anthony Appiah, who coined the term of rooted cosmopolitanism, really directly questioned in the BBC Reith lectures this kind of understanding, a narrow understanding of cosmopolitanism and patriotism. And I want to do the same in the next couple of minutes. So what does patriotism actually mean? Patriotism derives its essence from patria, the place of one's birth, the place of ancestral origin. Its etymology implies loyalty to one's birthplace, patria naturae, but also loyalty means attachment, emotional attachment, and the question is, to whom or what do we feel attachment? In this way, Cicero distinguished patriotic loyalty to one's birthplace from the loyalty to one's state, the fatherland, by law. So he calls it patria civitas. And this kind of duality provided the basis for the future emotional, but also legal and nationalistic bandwidth of the concept. Constitutional patriotism is an example. So in its development, particularly during the Enlightenment period, patriotism gained a kind of moral and emotional connotation in its understanding of loyalty and attachment. And its essence was public spiritedness, loyalty towards bonum commune, towards the common good, the welfare of a community, a region, or a state. So thus, in the German Encyclopedia Zedlers Universallexikon, the patriot described as an honest friend, this is really important, an honest friend of the country, a man, obviously, who leads the country and its people faithfully and honestly, and who takes its general welfare to heart, right? The word faithfully and honesty comes up here several times. Towards the second half of the 18th century, there was a shift towards the call for moral obligation towards all human beings, not only one's patria civitatis, the meaning of patriotism, in fact, returns to its classical republican roots. So the Encyclopédie agreed on patriotism as a love for one's country, but also added, and I quote, "But the most perfect patriotism is that which one possesses when one is so full of the rights of the human race that one respects them towards all the peoples of the world." And I read that again. "But the most perfect patriotism is that which one possesses when one is so full of the rights of the human race that one respects them towards all the peoples of the world." Here, patriotism overlaps with moral cosmopolitanism, the moral recognition of equality and human rights for all. But as we know, the promise of universal human rights did not translate into the practice of human rights, universal human rights, not even in the 18th century. But this moral cosmopolitanism and patriotism went also hand in hand with a republican demand for the preservation of national liberties. So Pohl suggests that when nationalism began to emerge in explicit doctrinal form towards the end of the 18th century, it adopted the language of republicanism, which enlightened monarchs such as Frederick II of Prussia, but also Catherine the Great of Russia and Gustav III of Sweden espoused. Yet in turn, at the same period, dynastic or imperial patriotism was still aligned to territorial loyalties, thus also to a ruling elite or dynasty, and found its expression in the civic duty for those smaller states. And this goes particularly for Germany at the time. So these discourses coincided, alternated, or were challenged by emerging ideas of nationalism. The term nation became increasingly prominent towards the end of the 18th century and changed meaning from the community of shared language and culture. This is sort of Gerda, really, who describes that it's cultural nationalism, to the idea of a nation state in the 19th century, to the ethno-neo-nationalism of some Western regimes today. So in short, historically, patriotism, moral cosmopolitanism, as both an epistemic and moral relationship to the historical world of humans, overlapped in their commitment to the common good of the patria and the world. And this is often forgotten in the debates around patriotism. So recently, Stephen B. Smith tried to reclaim patriotism, particularly for the US and left context. And he draws on Aristotle. He argues that patriotism is a learned disposition, fostered through our rituals, our customs, and our feelings. Feelings seems to come back quite a lot. Patriotism, he says, is more than simply a rational commitment to principles. By practicing it, it becomes a moral custom, something we do because we are the kind of people who does it, just as someone is honest or fair. In opposition to civic virtues such as independence, fair play, acceptance of moral responsibility, and critical reflection, Smith argues that this is a virtue-based approach to loyalty. It is an affection, not a rational decision. That is why Smith dismisses Jürgen Habermas's constitutional patriotism as insufficient. Habermas hoped that one could be patriotic on principle alone. He, of course, places it within a particular German context. Yeah. But Smith responds, and I quote, "Such a thin theory of patriotism lacks the effective connotation of pride, service, and loyalty that binds together members of a nation and makes them citizens. Patriotism," Smith emphasizes, "is more than a devotion to a set of constitutional procedures. It requires affection for a way of life." In short, Smith asks us to acknowledge the interdependence of our political and cultural identities. Patriotic loyalties, he writes, is underpinned by character-based habits and dispositions that constitutes a society's way of life. Everything, from our perceptions and feelings and beliefs to our cuisine, body language, posture, and accent. These thoughts, I think, are quite useful, as Smith calls for pluralism and respect for diversity and essence in this effective patriotism. In essence, actually, he returns to the moral cosmopolitanism and patriotism of the 18th century. Though, and this is an aside, he praises American patriotism as exceptional. So we gloss over that one, I think. What he says is that American patriotism at its best does not rely on indoctrination, but on teaching and supporting the virtues of civility, respect for law, respect for others, responsibility, honor, courage, loyalty, and leadership, all virtues worth having and keeping. Sadly, it seems that the extreme right in the US and elsewhere do not adhere to this. What prevails is ethnic neo-nationalism, the exact opposite to civic nationalism or constitutional nationalism. And nationalism as a key concept is equally diverse, actually, and difficult to pin down as cosmopolitan is or patriotism is. But suffice it for the purpose of this paper to make a difference between inclusive nationalism that celebrates liberal values of diversity and tolerance and exclusive nationalism that adopts a drawbridge approach. Fortress Europe, for instance, is a good example. Inclusive nationalism is driven by values, exclusive nationalism by ethnicity, race, and language. And these facets of nationalism are also embedded in the political landscape. I think it's fair to say that exclusive nationalism is located more to the far right of the political spectrum. But exclusive nationalism is often, but incorrectly, hailed also as true patriotism. And this is really where terminology is important. And again, I turn to Viktor Orban, and correct me if I get this wrong. I think that Orban uses patriotism in the sense of autocratic neo-nationalism. There's very little about universalizing human rights unless the humans are Europeans, ethnically and culturally. And indeed, Orban has created a discourse of Christian European neo-nationalism that transcends the territorial neo-nationalism of other Western states, such as US, for instance, or increasingly also the UK. So this division of the world into spatially bounded civilization that is Christian, white, and European is of course also a fantasy. Historically sloppy, I would say, a revisionist imagined community. So in the case of Orban and Hungary, the civilizationist neo-nationalist transgresses national borders, but establishes a fortress of Europe, which of course is the antidote to cosmopolitanism. And now we come to cosmopolitanism. And I think it's tempting to understand cosmopolitanism as a coherent theory, or at least as a well-defined concept, but because it's an ism, right? But it has been in use for such a long time that it may be considered as something like a catchword or rhetorical tool. But let's go back again to the past to explore this a little bit more. So early proponents of cosmopolitanism included Jordanes, of course, and the Stoics. And these thinkers rejected the idea that one should be defined by one's city or state of origin only. So the Patriotism, which I mentioned earlier. Jumping into the 18th century, the concept had different and diverse meanings. For instance, in Germany, where these connotations pertain to moral cosmopolitanism, but you also have institutional cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan law, cultural cosmopolitanism, market cosmopolitanism, and so on. I direct you to Pauline Kleingeld, who listed these for the 18th century. But of course, being cosmopolitan could also be used as an abusive term, and I mentioned Theresa May earlier. But what is this about? This is about identity. Patriotism, nationalism, cosmopolitanism is about identity. Personal identity, yes, but also political identity. To be a citizen of the world, to be influenced and shaped by many cultures and it is what this is at stake. And it's also about responsibility. There's an ethical demand underpinning certain moral cosmopolitanism. The citizen of the world has to be loyal to universal principles of equality, justice, and freedom. And of course, I acknowledge that this universalism also can be criticized. It can be criticized in the sense of being elitist, Eurocentric. But what Letteval suggests is to take cosmopolitanism not as these different kinds of terms, but the utopian practice, basing her argument on Ruth Levitas and Immanuel Kant, of course. So what she says is that cosmopolitanism is central to reclaiming utopia as cosmopractice, referring to Immanuel Kant, who considers cosmopolitanism a part in the development of the rationality of human beings. So one important part of the fulfillment of the human capacity is the development of moral law, leading you to a utopia where there is no contradiction or conflict between moral law, political law, and the inclination of the will and desire. So Kant writes in Towards Perpetual Peace, the growing prevalence of a narrower or wider community amongst the people of the earth has now reached a point where the violation of right at any one place on the earth is felt in all places. I think this is such an important sentence, is felt in all places. For this reason, the idea of cosmopolitan right is no fantastic or exaggerated conception of right. Rather, it is a necessary supplement to the unwritten code of constitutional and international right for public human right in general, and hence for perpetual peace. Only under this condition can one flatter oneself to be continually progressing towards perpetual peace. In this passage, the strictly defined cosmopolitan right, which Kant defines via hospitality, opens up for a community among all the peoples of the earth, which is attached, of course, to an idea of development towards fulfillment of the final goal or of the full fulfillment of human capacity. Kant's home for a free human being in a peaceful world has been food for imagination for a long time, and some have argued it influenced, for instance, the formation of the European Union. But perhaps we could agree that Kant proposes an implicit utopia here, a utopia of a better world for everyone, a utopia formulated in a specific time and space, which then could serve as an inspiration for action and organization. Just as Kant suggests that a violation of right at any one place on earth is felt in all places. If utopia is a method and a practice, and cosmopolitanism is a method and practice, then it's important to look at the cosmopractice of world citizenship. So there were, I think, roughly 3 waves of, or manifestations of world citizenship groups, I think. The first wave was in 1937 to 1940 as an effort to really counter the narrow nationalism represented by fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and militaristic Japan. The outcome, however, of this movement and the resistance to fascism in France led to the foundation of the UNESCO and UNESCO's emphasis on understanding among cultures. So I'll point you very briefly at UNESCO's exceptional program of future literacy, which is really important also to utopian scholars. But of course, utopian literature way before that had envisaged the idea of cosmopolitan world governments, like Kant, to ensure perpetual peace. So it was driven by peace movement. So just to mention one, of course, is H.G. Wells, who devised a League of People as a counterpoint to the League of Nations. He posited that the inequalities in economics, education, democratic structures across the globe, dividing first and third worlds would, as the League of Nations has shown, empower certain nations which were not ready, according to him, to rule independently. So for this reason, he supported the idea of smaller unions, which could ultimately lead to general synthesis when the time was right. So it's a form of empire pooling, which is very problematic. But he supported the idea of smaller units, not nations, to ensure the distribution of goods, the management of trade. And I refer here to men like gods. So the operative, there we are, I've got to muddle up a little bit, never mind. The operative word in his writing was freedom. And what he suggested was that there will be little need for president or king to lead the marshaled hosts of humanity. For where there is no war, there is no need for any leader to lead hosts anywhere. And in a polyglot world, a parliament of mankind, or any sort of council that meets and talks, is an inconceivable instrument of government. And Wells preceded some of these thoughts already in the novel The World of William Clissold, where he suggested that the cosmopolis will not be a world kingdom or nor a world empire, nor a world state, but a business organization. So the post-democratic world order will be an economic one. And something that he elaborated further in his piece, After Democracy. Wells did not support free market capitalism, but advanced global political institutions and non-communist central planning as alternative to provide economic and social justice for all. So here he differed slightly from John Stuart Mill or Richard Cobden, who proposed that free trade amongst nations would guarantee peace, a form of liberal economic pacifism. So this is just an example from the kind of first wave of global citizenship, and I think we need to count H.G. Wells in. I'm just going to, because I've got muddled up with my, it's okay. The second wave of world citizen action followed the atrocities of World War II, in which Gary Davis was a key figure, and one could kind of say this lasted from the late 40s to the 50s. In 1953, Gary Davis, he was the one who tore up his American passport, founded the World Service Authority, a non-profit organization that aimed to and promote a kind of world laws, three world laws: one God or absolute value, one world, and one humanity. What he highlighted was that the UN was exclusive, a mere discussion forum, but not a forum to implement human rights and world unity. And in 1949, he famously disrupted the UN meeting, and it's on YouTube, actually, I found it the other day. And he says, "Mr. Chairman and delegates, I interrupt in the name of the people of the world, not represented here," right? So he felt that the UN was not fully representative. "Though my words may be unheeded, our common need for world law and order cannot be disregarded." So he's quite an interesting person to look at, and I've put some references to his writings on the slide. So possibly the third wave of world citizen action began after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of neo-nationalist movements. So the Association of World Citizens, but also Democracy Without Borders, with their emphasis on conflict resolution, human rights, ecologically sound development, and understanding amongst cultures, is the moving force of this third wave. Now I have to go back, because I'm muddled up. So one of them is, this is the Democracy Without Borders and their mission statement. I won't read out everything, but I'm just summarize it briefly. It advocates, or the organization advocates, democracy as a human right, democracy that spans across all levels, from the local to the global, and includes the dimensions of representation, participation, and deliberation, really true democracy. In another section of the manifesto, they also highlight that all human beings, irrespective of place of birth or any other difference, need to enjoy equal rights as global citizens of a democratic global community. And then they also say that we support a planetary worldview that allows individuals to understand their close connection to the planet and all of humanity, and to develop a sense of global identity and solidarity. So they move from democracy without borders, so across the globe, to a planetary perspective. Another critic who developed something quite similar is Daniele Archibugi, who proposed in his Global Commonwealth of Citizens from 2008, the formation of a world parliamentary assembly with purely advisory role, at least, right? What he suggests is that the recent movement towards greater inclusion of global civil society under the auspices of the UN is not enough. So he also advocates, which is quite interesting, for the institution of a thin cosmopolitan citizenship, including universal rights, limited duties obtaining on all persons. So what he wants is a bit like Davis' cosmopolitan citizenship, which could provide a kind of secondary legal status, complete with passports and basic income entitlements for such highly vulnerable groups as refugees. So this is quite an interesting development of global citizenship. But there's always a but, isn't there? In the light of climate distraction and increasing wave of climate refugees, the question is if cosmopolitanism is indeed the answer. One could argue that the cosmopolitan approach to climate distraction is anthropocentric. It sees the climate crisis as a common problem, but not as a universal one, universal as affecting all humans and non-humans. So I refer you here to Chakrabarty's The Climate History in a Planetary Age that reminds you of the necessity of planetarity. The question of universality is somewhat re-articulated in the framework of planetarity. So we need to rethink the planet as an entity that unifies without recourse to ready-made totalizing vision of humanity. So for Chakrabarty, the planet is an agent of unification as a result of a shared thread to human and non-human survival. Thus, as Yannicka suggests, it is to propose a new ecological ground narrative that would redefine the place of human beings in relations to non-human others for the age of climate, the climate crisis. And this ground narrative would have to be more intersectionally diverse than its problematic predecessors, and would have to include non-humans as integral to a definition of the planet. And it also would, in some ways, enlarge the scope of political action from small-scale local activism to much broader and widely impactful initiatives. And let's move forward now because I get it all muddled up. Oh, here's the two references I made earlier, and then here. So for that, I refer you to Manns and Wainwright's Climate Leviathan, which came out in 2018. Can you see the? Yeah, it's super. They proposed a theoretical model with 4 potential global responses to the climate crisis, based on 2 variables, which is the planetary sovereignty or anti-planetary sovereignty, capitalism and non-capitalism. Okay. The authors believe that the most likely pathway of the future, quite depressingly, is a climate leviathan, which is very close to the status quo, a vision of capitalism in the United States and China. Basically, they make the decisions for the world. The name of this option is, of course, reference to Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan, right? The kind of multitude united in one person to form the Commonwealth. Climate Leviathan looks sort of like the climate agreements we have with all the COP meetings, a display of hegemony under the guise of solving climate change. If Leviathan is the future, these authors argue, the inequalities that we have seen produced by climate change thus far will be endlessly reproduced. Then they say, I find the names really funny, Climate Mao keeps planetary sovereignty in a non-capitalist world. In this scenario, the authors say, we can picture a Maoist dictator gaining power from advocating against capitalism, but maintaining the world order. Mao. Like Leviathan, we only will hear the voice of one. The state will determine who can emit carbon, who can use what resources, and how waste will be regulated. Climate Mao reflects a demand for rapid, revolutionary, and state-led transformation. And then they have Climate Behemoth, which is the biblical monster paired with Leviathan, which is the reverse of Climate Mao. Capitalism remains, but we see a kind of tilt in the world balance, a form of revolutionary anti-state democracy. Behemoth is the masses. Leviathan's greatest threat, in fact. In the age of Trump or Orban, it's not hard to see what the authors predict, that as climate changes, the world will grow more fascist. Finally, this brings us to climate X, the last one here on the scale, the least imaginable, but possibly the most utopian possibility. It builds on the second vision of a revolutionary anti-state democracy, but the key difference is that the movements that are confronting climate change will also confront capitalism. Since both capitalism and climate change perpetuate the same inequalities, climate X determines that a future that confronts the climate crisis will also confront capitalism. Really, what we could argue is that climate X is the biggest challenge to our imaginations, but arguably can reap the highest reward by disrupting the current systems that promote and reproduce vast inequalities in today's society. It is truly democratic, planetary, and utopian. The ultimate question is not if humans will suffer or whose historical grievances will be addressed, or whether we are true patriotists or neo-nationalists. The ultimate question and the measure of other concerns is how much of the biosphere will endure. Without a biosphere, all our other concerns really are moot. So to return to my point of departure and also close this, if patriotism is in essence the desire for common good for one's place of home or state, yet also for mankind, then planetary patriotism is the common good for all non-humans and humans alike. And to close, I just want to cite Satish Kumar, who said that the cosmos is our country, the planet Earth our home, and nature our nationality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And now, as you also kept the time beautifully, we have enough time for question and answers. So I'm turning to the floor if anybody would like to make a comment or ask a question.
Everyone needs a coffee.
Yes, right there.
Thank you very much for an excellent.
Sorry, I'm also a bit hard of hearing.
Sorry, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. We talked about freedom, patriotism, and a lot of things. The utopian question that I have is democracy possible in the absence of politics?
Ooh, what do you mean by in the absence of politics?
Whatever definition of politics you can actually.
I have no idea. Personally, and this is, I think, what I played out in the paper is, and you can see it, I think, in both left and right wing formations, certainly in Europe. I don't know beyond Europe, I'm afraid, is that people are disenchanted and have actually no trust in political institutions. So with the absence of politics, actually, it can also be an advantage, can't it? That people take over politics and take over the government. So you have People's Parliamentary Organization, certainly launched now in Britain by Just Stop Oil. I don't know if you've come across them before. They're the people who glue themselves to motorways and as a form of quite crass activism, but necessary activism. So what they now develop is that, particularly in the light of the UK elections coming up tomorrow, is that with the absence of trust in politics, they have started to form now citizens' parliamentary representation groups and come from underneath and take over governmental institutions. Not sure how that pans out, but for me, that's the only way possible. Democracy has to come from underneath and turn over and refuse to obey and buy into current world governments, really. That is the wooliest answer known to man, isn't it? But that's where I'm coming from. Okay.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for such a beautifully structured panorama of this journey through patriotism to cosmopolitanism and beyond. You mentioned briefly, very briefly, just in passing, futures literacy.
Yeah.
And I've been doing some thinking and work on this. And futures literacy, as you know, is all about the democratization of imagining the future, which, you know, really correlates well with what we think about in utopian studies. And Climate Leviathan is it's kind of doing the opposite of that, isn't it? And having been to some futures studies conferences and working with people on futures studies, it really does seem as though the only way to imagine a better future or any future is if we really make the most important element of that future democracy.
And that's exactly it.
Yeah,
isn't it?
and I just wondered if you had any kind of reactions to that. And it's a nod, but tell me more.
It kind of feeds into what I just said to you, to the colleague here, is if people don't know, so I mean, there's spin-offs of that as well. Look up UNESCO Futures Literacy, and it started off with projects, particularly in the third world, in South Africa, I think, to involve local groups to imagine futures. So the idea is obvious that if you can't in your head imagine another future, you can't do it, right? You can't be activists, I guess. So you have to imagine it first. There also, I used to do some workshops with a game that works similarly, is when people can imagine how the world could be and what role they play in it. And this is really important with futures literacy, is you adopt the role, you choose a role. Do I want to be an advisor? Do I want to be a digger? Do I want to plant tomatoes? Do I want to, it doesn't matter what, right? Once you can imagine that, you can be an activist here and there. But it is also democracy from the ground up. So it started off with empowering what we would call third world countries with the tools to grab democracy and put it into practice. But then also it's about education, and it's about granting people civil rights across the planet. So absolutely. And I've done workshops like this even with activists in Oxford who was sort of disenfranchised and worn out, burnt out really. And it really helped them to say, okay, I can't do everything, but if I can imagine myself being the role of even one role in the, there's something called the Future Surf Club, and they have this game. I don't know why surfing, don't ask me. But there's even one role saying, I'm a listener. And it empowered people and say, if I'm a listener now for people's woes, then maybe I can turn this into some form of activism, right? But what I find frustrating is, at the moment, I was sitting yesterday thinking about this, is we're speaking to each other. We're converting the converted, aren't we? And then what's the point of that? I want to convert the unconverted. Right? I want to speak to people who don't necessarily have this kind of attitude. And that's the problem, I think. We all speak to each other. We go to these futures conferences. Yeah, we kind of more or less on the same page. But we need to talk to people who are not on the same page. And that, I think, is the next step, really. I don't know how to do that. If I did, I would be queen of the world. I think you all need a coffee now, don't you? Zsolt, can I have this?
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Professor, and please forgive my voice. I want to go back to something which I see as very sort of basic, like maybe even too simplistic, but I would like your comments on how a utopia finally remains an impossibility at some level. How even when you were to achieve a utopian democratic state, for example, there would be some communities, people who are marginalized within it, and that to do justice by everything is at some level always impossible. And therefore the need to constantly be striving towards a utopia as a characteristic of utopia. Like to me, a utopian world would also mean a world where we are constantly striving for the better. So that's striving as an important characteristic.
Otherwise you have totalitarianism, don't you? Or a static state. I feel that Lyman Tower Sargent is sitting like a little demon on my shoulders now. He goes, utopia is progress. You don't arrive. You just continuously work and rework. And I think a lot of colleagues here who worked on 20th and 21st century utopianism highlight precisely that. I'm kind of stuck on the past. My interest stops with 1814. After that, I'm like, well, not that interested. But right, I think it's about reworking and acknowledging, like Ursula Le Guin, for instance, did, is that if you do not adapt, change, constantly change, then you have a totalitarian state or a milder form of static state. More's Utopia is a good example. That's static because it doesn't allow influences from outside. But I think it certainly has changed in modern times, postmodern times. Yeah. Bonita.
Thank you, Nicole, for an extremely stimulating talk. I mean, I wanted to pick up on something that I'm in sympathy with. You brought out the civitas part of patriotism. I don't have to tell you, least of all you, about how exclusionary, nonetheless, thinkers of the Enlightenment such as Kant were, and Locke.
Yeah.
And those of us who, from the global south, have been recuperating the Enlightenment have had to sort of articulate that dialectic. Now, in that context, we're sitting here in a geopolitical world where I'm not deliberately not naming particular conflicts, but I was listening to your articulation of non-human futures and thinking of Kerry Wolf, who has reminded us that the animalized human, he has the species greed with the humanized human, the humanized animal, the animalized animal, and the animalized human. And there are animalized humans all over the world now in different contexts. We see that every time these grids are produced. And it is in this context that I was left with, it's always dialectical, utopia and dystopia, but it's part of the problem I still have with some of my wonderful post-human students whom I sympathize with. What do you do in a world where we're creating animalized humans in nation state after nation state? And how does your articulation of patriotism sort of relate to that? If I'm allowed that question.
Oh, Bonita. Don't know. I have to think about that. But I'm thinking Donna Haraway making kin. And it's an imagination of post-human identity that merges also with the non-human identities. That's including animals. And for me, that's the ultimate utopia. But it's also, for me, a call for humility. And I think I've spoken about this here before in this context, is for the most meaningful sentence from her work is, we are all compost. Do you know what? That brings it down to the level. Well, because that's all we are. And any form of exceptionalism or feeling special or superior or inferior. And I think if we can adopt that, I wonder, that humility, that doesn't have to be a religious one. I think it's a spiritual one, perhaps. I don't know, really. Satish Kumar kind of goes towards that as well, is the one that should guide us and might help your post-human students to embrace that, I think. Thanks, Bonita.
Maybe time for one more question.
Liz.
Thank you, Nicole. I also loved your paper. I was listening to a podcast with Yuval Harari, and he said that what is coming in the future is something totally unbelievable, and that is with AI, which is supposed to be artificial intelligence He calls it alien invasion. And of course, through artificial intelligence, it's the humans that have prepared and conducted artificial intelligence. But through artificial intelligence, AI can also produce a totally non-human that has no connections with humanity. And that could be the downfall of almost everything.
Cheerful thought. So I think there are, oops, sorry, I was shouting. There are two answers to the climate crisis, aren't there? So one is the technological one. It's like we can get ourselves out of this with certain kinds of technologies, with AI, with catalysts, with, well, I can't think of anything else, right? I don't believe that. I think it makes things worse. So AI kind of buys into this. We have some kind of technology that will get us out of this. I'm much more, I don't care about humanity that much, I have to admit, right? But also I think it's much more, what we need to look at is something that some people will call deep adaptation, that we face the climate crisis in a way that is non-technological, but is one there where we, with humility, face a disaster. There's a book that's just come out, but I haven't read it. It's called The Future of Climate Denying. Literally, it's just come out, which is quite interesting. So it kind of the more you invest in technology, the more you think you will survive, even as a post-human AI person. Right, but why is that not just another vision, a false vision and a false promise? If humanity dies out, there we are. I don't think that's a problem. What will happen is that nature will somehow restore, not in the same way, but will restore itself in a very different way, I guess. But it will. So this is my take on it. Is that terrible? As a utopian, I have this with Lyman all the time. It's like, I don't care really. And he said, but you're not a utopian because it's about humans. I'm like, oh, I don't care about humans. And it's like, so 5 glasses of wine later, we're still at the same debate. So that's all I can say. You're right? But it's false promises that AI is, you know, the answer, and that technology is the answer. All of you who have, like me, hands up flown here, which is evil by itself, it's the sin, right? Is you have to do everything yourself anyway, even with AI. So it's a false promise, and maybe we should just unveil false promises from what they are.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great final. We're not very optimistic, but great. So thank you, Nicole, for this wonderful presentation.